Hello, my name is Furchtgott-Roth. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director of the Center for the Economics of the Internet. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very delighted to have with us today Professor Christopher Yoo from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Professor Yoo is one of the most eminent scholars on communications and the Internet. He is one of the most frequently cited authors on issues related to network neutrality and a wide range of other issues, including intellectual property. And we're very delighted to have him come to Hudson today to speak with us about network neutrality and lessons that we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Yoo, welcome to Hudson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Is COVID-19 an opportunity to learn something about network neutrality, or is this not a good time to be understanding more about network neutrality?
I think it's a fantastic time to learn something. As your background in economics will tell you, one of the great opportunities to study something is when something changes that comes from the outside of what you're trying to study. And COVID-19 is definitely that. The usage patterns when the pandemic hit have changed dramatically. Before the stay-at-home orders kicked in, most people did their business connectivity from their workplaces, and when they went home, they tended to consume entertainment programming in the evening. We all know from the data that about 60% of that is all video. And generally what that means is you're downloading a lot of video, you're not uploading a lot back the other direction, maybe a few emails, but that very little going back. COVID-19 has changed things dramatically, which is people have been forced by the stay-at-home orders to do a lot of their work connectivity from home. And in addition, they've done a lot more video conferencing. The total consumption has gone up, but video conferencing requires you to send a lot of data back to the internet to an extent you never had to before. And it's changed the time of day from the evening to the late afternoon for the peak usage, and it's been a very interesting experiment on how things have developed. Now, for network neutrality, it's an interesting stress test to put on the network, which is we have a big spike in demand. Some people estimate maybe as much as an 80% increase in upload bandwidth and 40% increase in download bandwidth. And it gives a nice chance to ask, how have the networks handled this? And we have different policies adopted in different parts of the world, particularly with respect to network neutrality, that have really, and the development has shown new light on which ones have created a network that is more robust and has handled the stress better. And I guess the real headline is that US networks have proven up to the challenge, have handled the additional volume with virtually no problems whatsoever. In Europe, that wasn't so much the case. In fact, European regulators had to ask leading video providers such as Netflix and YouTube if they would throttle their traffic back from high definition video back to standard definition video, out of concern that the European networks just weren't up to handling that. And so it gives us a nice lens to say that there's a different impact based on how COVID has affected the different areas, and leads us to ask the natural question, what about the different policies we've adopted in the US and the EU? Does it teach us about which ones seem to be better adapted to handle something like COVID-19?
So the Europeans have asked the video providers to, in essence, throttle content. Isn't that one of the elements of network neutrality?
Well, yes, it's kind of ironic, and it would be a natural opportunity for network neutrality proponents to complain. So, I mean, the whole notion of network neutrality is you should treat all traffic the same. You shouldn't treat one application any differently from another. You shouldn't treat video different from voice, different from email, different from web browsing versus file transfer, whatever you want to use the network for, it's all supposed to travel the same. And here, it's not actually having the networks handle something different, but the solution is to have the content providers change their behavior, but targeting a specific kind of content that is extremely non-neutral. It does point out something else different, Harold, which is pragmatically, it is a solution that might work. So as I mentioned earlier, 60% of all traffic is this type of video. And to some extent, if you have an immediate problem caused by an unexpected emergency, such as COVID, it's a way that they can actually address the problem directly in a ways that actually solves reduces the traffic and takes the pressure off the networks. And it shows that some non-neutral solutions have possible a place in a policymaker's toolkit, particularly because video, there's technical aspects of video that makes this solution possible. We can't talk about taking text or and moving it from high definition to standard definition. You know, the emails and all that, it just doesn't even make sense. In fact, there is a very unique opportunity in video that's technical, that is not neutral across applications. It works for certain kind of applications, but not for others, and it works for video. And as we know from the transition from standard definition to high definition broadcasting, cutting it back from high definition to standard definition reduces the bandwidth by somewhere between a 1/4 to about 15, dropping it somewhere 75 to 80+% in terms of the bandwidth. And if that's 60% of the volume on the internet, boom, in one nice technical solution that's specific to video and only specific to video, you can do we can solve most of the problem, because video is the biggest part of it, and we have a technical fix that doesn't apply to any other kind of application. So it's a very pragmatic way to think about it. And historically, computer scientists have had that pragmatism. There's a famous line coined by David Clark at MIT. It's rough consensus and running code. It's not about grand principle. It's about finding things that work and actually solve problems.
Why have the U.S. networks been more robust than the European networks in dealing with the change in demand patterns?
Well, if we were to answer that with scientific accuracy, we'd have to do a lot of more studies. But what we've known for a while, and there's a growing body of literature, has shown that there's a very distinctive difference between the US approach and the European approach. Although in all fairness, the now European approach was originally pioneered by the US, and then eventually we moved away from it. So in some ways, it's a very successful policy export that we've made that we've actually learned doesn't work in all situations. And I think we realized that there's no one policy that's almost always the right policy. There's always a factual dependence. You know, it always strikes me that good policy analysis is that if your situation is like one way, you have one policy prescription, and if it looks another way, you have another one. So what were the two different approaches? So originally, when broadband first emerged, we didn't have to build entirely new networks. We were able to leverage the existing telephone network and cable networks, and with a minimum amount of reconditioning and adjustment, roughly about $400 per subscriber, we could actually make them capable of providing internet at higher speeds than dial-up speeds. And at $400 per person or $500, you're talking about recovering over a 5-year span, you know, $8 per month per user, and it makes sense. And so we had a situation there where it was taking the network that already existed and finding a way to repurpose it for more than just telephone or more than just cable television. And then they were focusing on sharing that infrastructure and keeping prices as low as possible. And they didn't really care about investment because it didn't require a lot of investment, and most of those networks were already built and already paid out. That was fit for a world which is dominated by email and web browsing. The world we live in today is radically different. Video requires a lot more bandwidth. We've seen the spikes. I mean, in fact, the traffic has been growing for a long time at 100% a year, and the number of businesses that can accommodate that kind of growth, it's extraordinary. It's dropped back quite a bit, but still it's growing at a very, very healthy clip and is being driven by video. And what we've realized is the new future of broadband is not just taking old networks and making them useful for new purposes. We're actually going to have to invest in fiber. We're going to have to invest in new cable infrastructure, in 4G, LTE, and the other thing everyone's talking about, 5G, the new wireless technologies, and invest not just leveraging the network that exists today, but put new money to create networks for the future to carry this additional volume. And that requires a very different policy. The US began with the sharing the network that exists today strategy, but we abandoned that in the early 2000s because we realized the importance of investment incentives. Europe has never left that strategy. And consequently, the work I've done shows that the European network providers have invested about 2.5 times less per household than Americans have. And that's not because they're irrational, it's because they're responding to the incentives given to them by the regulatory system, which didn't reward investments to provide better service and actually to attract new customers and to support video in a way that couldn't be done before. And in fact, the touchstone of European policy is not investment, it's prices. And there are worlds in which you compete on low prices and there's clear economic benefits from it. But what we've learned is not always about prices, sometimes it's about quality. And sometimes quality emerges by offering a higher quality product to consumers because that's what they demand. And in fact, that's what the US policy has been doing. It's been focusing on providing strong incentives for network providers to invest in higher quality, higher bandwidth, lower latency, more reliable networks. And we're seeing the impact, the long run impact of that difference in policy in the US network's better ability to handle the surge created by COVID-19.
Let me see if I understand this correctly. You're suggesting that the regulatory structure in Europe favors lower prices either through regulation or raised eyebrows or whatever reason, but also in essence a lower quality of service. In the U.S., we have more investment and that are more focused on investment and less concerned about prices. Am I interpreting your comments correctly?
Well, that's sort of the consequence. I would pivot it a little bit differently, which is if the European policy focuses on sharing the network that already exists, the infrastructure that already exists, and they have to set a price on which so someone built that network and has their capital invested in it, and you could ask them to give it away for free, but most places understand that if you do that, then that company will simply go bankrupt because they're giving their network, their own assets to their competitors for free. So they generally allow them to charge a fair cost-based price for that. But think about this. If everyone's just using the same network and the person who built it is just leasing it out to its competitors, by definition, you will not have differences in quality. You're all using the same network. You can't have a superior network quality. And second, think about what this does to incentives. If I were to invest in upgrading the entire network for everybody, I would have to share all the benefits with all the competitors who wanted to use it. And it's even worse because sometimes those investments succeed and sometimes they fail. What it really means is that if it succeeds, I'll have to share all the success with my competitors, in which case there's no upside. If it fails, no one's going to share it with me, and I have to eat all of the downside. And it creates a huge disincentive for the network owner to invest in upgrading their networks. There's another aspect, which is, well, what if you're one of the competitors? You now have two choices. You can invest in a new network infrastructure, which requires raising a lot of capital and taking a lot of risk, or you can simply continue to borrow or lease the network from the incumbent as it exists today, in which case you have no risk, and if you don't want to do it anymore, just don't renew your lease. So it actually puts a deterrent on competitors' incentives to invest in new networks, as well as incumbents' incentives to invest in new networks. There was a theory, and there is a theory of what they call the stepping stone theory, or what they call the ladder of investment, is that the competitors will only rely on the existing network temporarily and over time will make their own investments. That was a great theory, but as you know, many things are possible in theory. We actually have to study the empirics. And when we look at what happens in fact, the ladder investment doesn't work. They climb up a couple rungs, but they never actually go forward and build their own networks. And that in fact, we have now seen confirmation in the empirical literature that this kind of infrastructure sharing really does deter investments in new upgrades to give us the new bandwidth that video is demanding. As I said earlier, if someone once said policy is best made with very simple numbers that everyone can understand. If you look in the US, the typical network industry-wide, the industry has invested 2.5 times the amount of capital investment to upgrade the network per household than has happened in Europe, in the European industry. And so we start to see these really simple facts that demonstrate very eloquently what the result of an investment, quality-oriented policy is versus share the infrastructure as it exists today strategy are.
Has the COVID pandemic changed any policy perspectives in Europe?
Well, I think it's it's fascinating watching the results. So, there's a whole bunch of things that I also am tracking. For example, there's a great deal of discussion about privacy regulation. And in fact, every country around the world has put a lot of waivers on those because it was inhibiting information sharing in ways that we needed to do to enhance the research to fight it. Because one is partly treatment, but a huge part of this now is we need to find a vaccine. And we need to find longer-term therapeutic solutions that involve the kind of broad-based research studies that don't exist today. You're seeing a tremendous demand for telehealth applications and education applications. And what's fascinating also from a network neutrality standpoint is there is a policy called zero rating, which has proven relatively controversial among network neutrality advocates. And in Europe, this was one of the major focuses behind their big regulatory initiative in network neutrality. Zero rating is a policy where a network provider would say certain types of applications, that when you use a certain type of application, that traffic does not count against your data cap. So for example, most wireless plans have a data cap. You can only use so many gigabits of data any month. T-Mobile, for example, has a program called Binge On that says you can watch, if you sign up for Binge On, you can sign up for as much video as you want, and all that video traffic doesn't count against your data cap. As I said earlier, that's a big deal because video is the big consumer. They have another audio product for music called Music Freedom. And this is a good example of an innovative practice, particularly done by a provider who historically has been number 4 in the rankings and has struggled actually over time to deploy a network of the same quality as market leaders AT&T and Verizon. So what's interesting is the controversy around network neutrality controversy around zero rating. Binge On effectively makes video cheaper than all other applications on the internet. Why? It doesn't count against your data cap. And if you only have a certain amount of data you can use per month, now I have an incentive to favor watching video over everything else. And what's fascinating is, people say this is actually good for consumers. You're giving them extra stuff for free. As I said, this was all pioneered by under the first network neutrality order, and it was in a way very effective at attracting customers away from the large providers at a time where you didn't have a lot of bandwidth yourself. Set that all to one side. In Europe, they began to implement very strict regulations against this, and it became a huge controversy, and they've actually moderated what they said a little bit. Many countries around the world are zero rating telehealth applications and educational distance learning applications. Why? In this world, we need them. We can't go to the doctor, and schools, billions of children around the world have not gone to school for a long time. And again, this is a very pragmatic response to this that directly violates network neutrality, because you're now, by zero rating these applications, you're treating certain kinds of content preferentially, and it's in fact cheaper to access. Now, my point is not to launch that as a criticism. I think this is a fantastic policy. It is to be lauded, but it goes to show that this sort of dogmatic idea that all applications should be treated equally sort of blinks reality, that there's certain exigencies that we have that need application-specific responses. And the idea is, oh, the reason that's slow is because we need to build bigger networks and just make them run faster. Well, right now, that's not an option. It happened so suddenly, we couldn't build quickly enough. It takes months. But not only that, how can we morally justify making people putting themselves at risk to build some of these networks and all the things that are required to make that as a solution? In the short run, that just isn't much of an answer. And so finding other solutions that actually solve real problems, because the impact on school-aged children, on people who can't get the healthcare they need, is actually critical. And understanding that that requires a differential response is part of the insight, I think, that COVID-19 has given us into the flaws of adopting a policy that insists that every single application be treated exactly the same.
Well, Professor, could you go into a little bit more depth on these two types of zero rating, which have different effects on networks? Most most networks are designed to provide more data flow downstream and less upstream because most consumers aren't really doing a lot of uploading. And certainly the binge-on application you described would be almost exclusively downstream. On the other hand, telehealth and educational applications are two-way. I don't know if they're entirely balanced, but it's a very different load being put on networks. Do these different types of zero rating have different effects on the network, and have the networks been able to accommodate these different types of zero rating?
So what's interesting, you're hitting a very important point here, Harold, which is the growth of video conferencing applications, just like the one we're using right now, has put an increased pressure on upstream volume. And it's interesting, I've been involved in conversations recently where people are now saying, oh, we need to do symmetrical volume. We need to allocate the same amount of capacity for downstream downloading from the web down to you as allocate the same amount of that as upstreaming from when you're actually sending my signal back to Hudson right now. And there's it's funny how this has become sort of politicized, which there are many people who believe in symmetrical bandwidth as a matter of principle. They want to favor peer-to-peer production or these different ideas, or they really like fiber and they're pushing that. And there's no question fiber is an extremely good technology for doing that. The growth, as I said, has been double. There's a 40% increase in downstream bandwidth according to data collected by a company called Open Vault, and they've published it. The downstream download volume has increased about 40%. Uploading has increased 80%. And some people say, oh, that's going to mean we should that's a case for symmetrical. Well, actually, it's not. If you look at the data, the ratio between downloads to uploads bandwidth is 20 to 1 before COVID. It's now 16 to 1. So yes, it's changed, but we still download far more content than we upload. And that's one of those things where we have to look at the data and to say, oh, we should have a symmetrical allocation of this bandwidth right now would actually hurt consumers dramatically, because what we're seeing in the data is the average consumer still downloads far more than they upload, and if we insist on making that exactly balanced, that just won't work. Now, there's another interesting aspect that ties into the network neutrality dispute, which is there was a committee set up by the Federal Communications Commission of technological experts, and they were studying that existed under the previous open internet orders, which have now been repealed and superseded by the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. But back then, they would actually answer technical questions. And at one point, Apple FaceTime was deploying what was one of the first very widely used video chat features. And it was a really interesting experiment. And one of the problems they discovered is that a single video FaceTime user would consume about 1/3 to 1/2 of the upload bandwidth of any one node. And what they discovered was because there was no charge for usage, Apple had the means to make it more efficient, but they had no incentive for doing so. Why? Because they weren't charged incrementally for their upload bandwidth, whether they sent up a little or sent up a lot. And what most economists will tell you is things that are zero priced tend to be overused. It's just, if you get any benefit out of it. I remember I saw this. We used to, when I was teaching at Vanderbilt, we used to have no charge for printing. And what happens, we discovered is, I think it was like 80% of things that students printed to the school's printers were never picked up. Why? They were thinking, if there's any chance I'm going to need this, even like a tiny 1 cent value, they just printed it because the cost of them was zero. We changed that to a system where we put a limit on the number of pages they could print. And we set it at 10 times the amount that the average student printed. So in fact, there was the chance, essentially no students hit the ceiling. And the nasty little secret, which we didn't publicize, and if a student did, we would waive the ceiling. But essentially what we did is we put a small price on printing. And then someone had to decide, okay, I have this very liberal cap of pages, but I do have to consider if I print something, it's not free, it's going to make me run out of my cap a little bit sooner. And what happened was the excess printing dropped dramatically. So that's a very simple example. When you price something at zero, it gets overused for things that really are generating no value to consumers at all. And that in fact, these sorts of internal signals within markets do go a long way to not only to rationalizing individuals' behavior and alleviating demand, not by clipping off the demand, but by actually making people make more economic decisions. And I think one of the interesting things we saw with the network neutrality debate, particularly the interconnection aspects, many people were insisting on what they called zero price interconnection. And many economists responded that zero priced products, sometimes that's the right price by magic, but rarely you should have prices that vary based on the flows and values, and the direction in which the money can flow can change. And you should actually have these accommodated in a much more dynamic way. But the number of opportunities where it makes sense to, the number of situations where it makes sense to set a price to zero and regulate it that it must be zero are vanishingly small. And so what you see is, what you'd like to have is a system that is market responsive to the demands for upload bandwidth and download bandwidth. You actually have network providers who are extremely well aligned to provide consumers with what they want in terms of this. They've got a lot of flexibility, and they are revisiting and looking at it, because I do think COVID-19 will make some permanent changes in how we consume bandwidth. So for example, Facebook has announced that they're going to extend working from home for many of its employees permanently. And I'll tell you, I'm doing some studies on educational technology. Teachers have historically been very resistant to innovating in this space, but they're being forced to do so, and they're discovering that in fact it's improving their education outcomes, and it's gotten some teachers who are having a hard time getting off the bump and really getting and trying new things. They're actually trying new things and becoming more experienced at them. And so we probably will see a longer term change in the way people use technology. Telehealth, I think doctors who've been reluctant to do anything but in-person treatment recognize that not all healthcare problems require you to physically examine a patient. Many things can be handled through telemedicine in ways that are much more cost effective for our healthcare system, which, as you know, the costs are, as a percentage of GDP, have been continuing to rise. And finding new solutions, we're going to see new things, and this stuff is going to change dramatically. Locking ourselves into any particular vision, particularly one that was rooted in the past, is probably a mistake. We need to study new phenomena dynamically as they continue to evolve.
Well, speaking of zero price, you just gave us a list of things that have been zero rated, and zero pricing leading to over consumption and not providing economic incentives in the marketplace. So we have zero rating for video, we have zero rating for telehealth, we have zero rating for education. We have the pledge by the FCC chairman to various broadband providers not to cut off customers even if they don't pay their bills, not to excuse their bills, but essentially call it an interest-free loan until they can afford to pay these. How are the providers managing with essentially all these freebies that are being handed out?
Well, some of them predate COVID. So like Binge On, we've talked about. Part of it is they're able to reduce the amount of traffic that's required by it. Part of it's also a marketing ploy. I mean, think about who Binge On will appeal to. With all due respect to you and me, Harold, I don't think we're their target audience. You know, it's the young people, and that's the reality. And in fact, when you have a network that is not of the same quality, I think in the incentive auction, T-Mobile's been very aggressive at bidding for new spectrum and has a plan to become increasingly competitive. But as of this moment right now, I think people would say any assessment of their spectrum holdings, that's not quite there yet. So you've seen this in other countries, is they often will use things like zero rating programs as essentially marketing programs. When you can't quite match in network quality, you provide some other benefit. Other providers have zero rated messaging, text messaging, or different services, zero rated WhatsApp, zero rated different things that are more appealing. There's also, this is you mentioned at my introduction, I'm a law professor. I'm also a computer science professor, and I have a secondary appointment there. And it always strikes me how people often don't understand certain technical aspects, which is When it comes to static content like video, pre-recorded video, you can actually pre-position that in local caches, local storage facilities very close to the end user. And that in fact, if you zero rate that content, in fact, it costs less to serve that because you don't have to go through the entire network to retrieve it from some distant location on the West Coast or some other place. And it's so funny to me, in this debate, there is a misconception of what non-discrimination looks like. The economic description of non-discrimination is a price differential that's not justified in a difference in cost or a difference in quality. So for example, if you're selling, giving a volume discount, because if someone buys a truckload quantity, it is not a violation of a non-discrimination principle to charge them a lower price. Why? It's cheaper to ship on a per unit basis a truckload quantity of material than it is to ship a single one. Oddly enough, if you charge the same price for shipping one as a truckload quality, even though you're charging the same price, you're violating a non-discrimination mandate. Why? There's a real difference in price and cost that you're not reflecting. And so the irony here is there's been a lot of zero rating cases where providers zero rated people who access their own content, their own website or their own storage, there's cloud storage facilities, which almost certainly were cheaper for that company to provide than access to other things. Why? They don't have to pay, it's their own facility. They don't have to pay what we call transit, the cost of accessing someone else's facility. And that, in fact, that was criticized as anti-competitive when, in fact, from a pure non-discrimination idea, which is what the whole network neutrality debate is designed to get at, the failure to charge less would have been the problem, not charging less. And so there's a deep irony to me about how people misconceive on a technical basis the fact that certain services are, in fact, cheaper to provide, and sometimes programs such as zero rating to certain types of content are reflections of that, and are ways, let's never forget, to give cheaper prices to consumers, which increases their surplus, which is how we create value and how we improve social welfare and under traditional measures. And the other thing is, if you're giving higher quality, that's something that often evades our traditional analysis of social welfare in the price quantity space. There are models we use to develop and to analyze those as well, but they're not as well established. But it's one of those things which I think is often also lost in the shuffle in ways that are, I think we're now growing to appreciate more and more.
One of the proposed solutions sometimes in communications is to have government ownership of broadband network. And this idea comes up time and again, both at the federal level in the United States, but particularly at the municipal level. You've done some research on this. Tell us about what your findings are for government ownership of broadband networks.
Well, there's no question that COVID-19 has radically has caused some people to raise this as an argument, and frankly, it's understandable. We're talking, the whole network neutrality debate is based around the idea of how traffic is treated through a network. There are a large number of families who are now under stay-at-home orders and trying to educate their children who don't have access to connectivity at all. And the question of how they wish they had a problem where they could debate how traffic is treated through a network, that's a second order consideration behind having a network in the first place. And so this is a real issue because in those parts of the United States that don't have access to connectivity, there are understandable and important calls to try to find new solutions to reach those people. And one of the solutions people are looking to are government-owned networks. And so I would say, going back to the old adage, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, I think there's a lot of history here, and there's, I would say we should look at the history and we should look at the current analysis. So let's look at the history. I mean, the most recent history is there once was a very vibrant municipal Wi-Fi movement that is, I don't think this is controversial, is now dead and is widely regarded as a failure. But if you go back even further, what you see is for the better part of the 20th century, the only country with a privately owned network was the US. We had an early, it was originally Great Britain also had a privately owned network by BT, which they nationalized. They said this is going to cause prices to go down and service to go up. The fact was neither thing happened. Prices went up and service went down. And through about the 1980s, the US telephone system was the envy of the world. Other countries were laboring behind wait lists for service that went into like 5, 6, 7, 8 years. There were black markets for telephones. Long distance was extremely expensive and of very poor quality. And none of that was true in the US. And so starting with the privatization of British Telecom in 1984, we saw throughout the 1990s this wave of privatization of telephone companies, of telecommunications companies, that has radically benefited consumers. Prices have dropped, utilization has soared, and is widely regarded as a policy success. So at a very top line level, we should, before we go running into this idea, we should remember this broader sweep of history, both the privatization movement, also Muni Wi-Fi, and there's different aspects of studying this, including a famous article by Nobel laureate George Stigler of municipally owned electric power, where we see the facts actually show that private ownership has proven more successful and more robust. On a more immediate level, so that's the past. What about the present? I was listening. One of the things I'd hear is people talking about the great success of municipal fiber and government-owned fiber. And I really wanted to know empirically what's going on. So I actually, a couple students and I pulled the audited financial statements of every municipal fiber build in the United States. And it's interesting because all data has strengths and weaknesses. The audited financial statements have two virtues. This is the information that financial markets and people who invest make decisions on. And so it's intended to be a uniform set of information that provides the critical information for people to assess the risk and the likely success of programs. It also is the information that people go to jail for if they lie on it. And so, I mean, it is the highest quality information we have about performance. And it tells a very interesting story, which is, in a way that there's a municipal fiber project could be doing one of three things. It could be earning money enough to pay back the debt they borrowed to finance the program, because almost all these had to issued a bond or some other form of liability to fund the build out, and they were supposed to recover it over the span of some 30 years, because these tend to be 30-year bonds. Some of them are earning a little bit, but not enough to pay off the bonds. Some of them actually are not earning money year on year. They're sinking farther and farther into debt every year they operate. And so they borrowed money, and every year they operate, it gets worse and worse. And in the end, there are actually some of those that have gotten worse and worse that have already gone bankrupt. And so what I found is that among these categories, about 20% seem to be on track to cover their debt, which is a great story, and there are some success stories. About 10% are earning some money, but they're not earning enough. They're not falling farther into debt, but they're not earning enough to have a reasonable prospect of paying back what they borrowed. 50% of them are cash flow negative every year. That is, they're going farther into debt every year they operate. And 20% of them have already gone bankrupt, which is having an adverse impact on their cities. It's hurting the credit rating and so on. And it's been a big problem. And there are, people have suggested to me that there are investments cities make knowing they won't get their money back. So school bond issues, you don't make money on schools, but you write those bonds to set aside revenue every year to defray those costs, and it's built into the expectation in the bond instrument that this is going to be financed out of sales tax revenue or property tax revenue or something. All the bond issues I've looked at were written on the idea that these things were going to break even or actually going to make money. And that just hasn't been the case. And there's been some out and out disaster stories that are going to haunt cities for a very long time. And so my lesson from this is that if you look at the way these things are being deployed now, it's not to say there are no circumstances under which you should even consider this. I would want to study this very carefully to figure how likely am I going to be in one of the 20% who are making this work, or is my city going to be in the 80% that is struggling? And I certainly would talk to leaders in cities of both kinds to find out what they think made it work. And I would also make sure that you put this up for a competitive bid, because if there isn't aren't multiple providers who want to offer to give you the service, that's a sure red flag to me that this is a business model that carries a lot of risk, and that you should be very careful.
When municipalities have their own broadband network, aren't there usually competitive providers as well? Or are municipalities building where no competitor would dare to build that work?
So among the cities we studied, 95% of the government networks were actually building in areas where they already had service from another provider. It's what we call overbuilding. It's remarkable. So what's interesting for the 5%, I understand. These cities will tell me, look, I understand this is a risky proposition, but I have to do something because they need to be responsive to their citizens. I have an answer to what they should be doing, and it's probably not fiber because fiber is probably the most expensive way to build. There's a bunch of interesting fixed wireless solutions and alternative solutions, which I think people should experiment with more. But for the 95%, they find that they're actually really struggling. So what's fascinating to me is many of them are surprised that what happens is the incumbent provider, when they start providing service, drops price. And they accuse them of all these nefarious things like predatory pricing. Well, guess what? If you're a company that has a monopoly that faces competition for the first time, the rational thing and the thing that policymakers want to happen is for prices to drop. And that's not anything, that's not some sinister move. That's a very natural reaction that any market should do. And that, in fact, what you discover is many of the plans were based on the idea that prices would maintain at their monopoly level, and they didn't make the assumptions necessary, as we all know, the Cournot assumptions and all these other things that you should expect that there's going to be a response. That's the rational thing to happen. You should base your plans that way. And so many of these plans were unsound to begin with. Many of them didn't allocate any capital expenses for anything after year one. And we know that that might have been true for old primitive networks. We just build them and run them. With broadband networks, they constantly require reinvestment. That's just the reality of them. And what you see is these cities were often based on unrealistic sets of expectations. But the other part of it is we're trying to study the success factors, whether it's about were they too expensive to build, were they too expensive to operate, or was it really on the revenue side? And is it CapEx, OpEx, or revenue? And the evidence is suggesting that the reason most of these muni fiber builds struggle has to do with the revenue side. And many of them think that if they built it, all the citizens out of loyalty to the city would just start to sign up for them as a provider. As anyone who watches television now knows, if you're going to run a telecom company, you've got to have some trendy new ad every month, and you have to give someone who's already getting service from another provider a reason, an affirmative reason to switch, because there are some costs associated with that. You have to get used to new billing, and you have to get hooked up, and there's a bunch of things, a bunch of steps that are required. And what we're discovering is that the municipals, while they may be prepared, some of them, not all of them, are prepared to run a network properly in terms of the operations or to build a network. Many of them, the reason they fall short is the revenue numbers just don't hit the numbers that they projected. And sometimes that's because the projections are overly optimistic, like 80% of penetration. And I'll tell you right now, no provider under any has ever achieved anything like that. But even the ones with more reasonable ones probably underestimated how hard it is to attract customers. Being the CEO of a telecom company is a full-time job. And you usually have to have a director of marketing whose entire job for an entire business year is to actually figure out how to respond to the market and create packages and promotional programs that will attract users. There are many reasons that people go into public service and municipal government. Those tend not to be at the top of the list. And so, what I discover is that very hardworking, well-meaning, conscientious, public officials have a hard time making these things work. And I had a number of conversations with people in Madison, Wisconsin, and to their credit, instead of jumping in both feet with a municipal fiber project, they ran a pilot. And they saw how it went on all the different sides. And I don't know how that ended up, but the last time I spoke with them, the numbers weren't coming in the way they'd hoped, and they were in the process of rethinking, of asking themselves, do we go forward with this project or not?
You mentioned earlier that there was the antecedent to municipal Wi-Fi 15, 18 years ago. Is this the same experience that municipalities are having with broadband build out as they had with Wi-Fi build out?
There's a lot of similarities. I would say that many of the business models behind the muni fiber are at least more realistic. Some of the Wi-Fi ones were free, So there's never going to be a sustainable business model, and they didn't really have a means for transitioning into them. Many of them were pet projects of mayors. And then when the mayor's office turns over, guess what? The new mayor isn't exactly enamored of the idea of continuing with the existing project. There are also other antecedents. There are a number of municipal cable operations that have been studied, and they sort of tell a similar story, although I haven't done the sort of comprehensive analysis of cable because that's not what's trendy right now. And what you see, though, is understanding that these are tricky businesses. You know, they're hard to run. And in fact, one of the stories that you and I both know is we talk about the US as having a privately owned telecom system. One of the more interesting phenomena was what many people don't know is the federal government actually took over the telephone system in the US for 1 year during World War I. And what they discovered is it was at a time where they had to make decisions about which technology to go forward with. It's when we were switching from switchboards to mechanical switching. What we learned is that, in fact, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that governments, when they sometimes can manage things like water or natural gas, where the distribution technology hasn't changed in decades, and that, in fact, they built stuff years ago that's still working today, and it doesn't require that same sort of capital reinvestment. The lesson from this time was these networks are very difficult to run, and that was telephone. That was simple compared to what broadband is today. And with the new technologies and deciding what to invest in, it's become a much riskier proposition. Governments don't do risk capital. You know, they do government bonds, and they like nice steady streams, and they can handle at best projects that are very predictable. But when you're expecting someone to take an entrepreneurial risk, saying, well, there's a 1 in 20 or 1 in 10 or a 1 in 50 chance this is going to pan out, and if it doesn't pan out, we eat a lot of losses, but if it works, we're going to do really, really well. That's not a risk profile that governments take on very well. And that is, in my mind, an unrealistic task to ask them to do. And we know that a lot of these new technologies require a lot of upfront investment of capital. Some of them pan out, some of them don't. And even if they aren't failures, bear in mind, if the revenue comes in too slowly, you have to borrow money on day zero, and you have to be making capital payments on that from the moment you start the project, even before you get revenue. And it's a race. If the revenue comes in fast, this is a great investment, and if it comes in really fast, it's a brilliant investment. If it comes in slowly, you're gonna have to eat those losses. And in fact, so even if you've got a technology that you know is gonna be important someday, the timing of it is critical. And so people who talk about future-proofing a technology as an excuse, the payments you make from day zero are real and are coming out of the fisc and is limiting what you can do in other parts of the city, what it's doing. And so actually building a network that is before its time can be extremely expensive for taxpayers and extremely bad for consumers.
So, Professor Yoo, if I understand what you're saying about risk capital, that the government is not particularly good at it when there needs to be a lot of technological innovation. If we look at the COVID-19 pandemic now, that would seem to be a situation where there needs to be more, not less, risk capital, because the future is very unpredictable now. So this would seem to be not a very good time for more government investment in telecommunications networks. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I think that's probably right. You know what? At the risk of being too much like an academic, you know, when unexpected things happen, we learn things. You know, by trying, it's been a compelled response to try new things. The risk profile is not congenial to the idea of undertaking huge capital investments right now. You know, if you'd asked us a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago that we predict where we are today, I don't think any of us would have gotten 100% accuracy. And as we at the universities are trying to figure out how we're going to do it, how things are going to roll out in the fall, I'll tell you right now, every university is running multiple contingency plans because we don't know quite what this is going to look like. For the foreseeable future, this is the new normal. And so in that world, as you probably know, many companies, in terms of whether it's capital investments or hiring, they're hitting the pause button. You know, they're trying to figure out, you know, what this is going to look like and to really get a handle on the risks. And I think that that's prudent. And there will be some changes that are enduring. We're going to have to study them. Fortunately, there's a lot of people working on taking advantage of what we can learn from COVID to see if we can figure out how to serve those communities that don't have connectivity better. And that's a critical resource. But I think also between the government and private industry, it's created a consensus and a commitment to try to address some of these problems in ways that probably weren't as strong before. So I think there's an opportunity as well.
Well, Professor Yoo, for the audience, if you were here in person, we would all be applauding you enthusiastically for teaching us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you so much.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.